Hi, welcome. All right, so today is a very confusing and important topic, mixed voice singing and what that means. And we're going to do a little bit of a discussion at first, and we'll talk about some exercises, of course, because that's most important. But it bears a little bit of discussion about what we mean by mixed voice and why it's sort of a confusing term. And in a lot of ways, this is kind of the most advanced singing, which is your ability to switch back and forth between registers and have a whole bunch of different kinds of tone qualities. I'm just going to wait a little bit until we get some more people. But ultimately, I'm very excited to share all of this. And please, always, as always, ask questions. I want this to be a little more interactive if possible, because there's a lot of questions about mixed voice and what it means. And hopefully, I can help demystify some of the things or at least explain why it's so confusing. Yes, exactly. Mixed voice is definitely something you need patience for. In fact, just as a plug, right now, one of the things about learning mixed voiced is it's a more advanced technique. So you're gonna want to work on chest voice and head voice separately first. Hi, Alex, welcome. Um, yeah, you're gonna want to work on these things separately and first make sure that you can access uh, chest voice and head voice separately. Um, so, does Joe Elliott use mixed voice? I'm not entirely sure. I need to look that up and listen to it a little bit. But my answer to you is that everybody is using mixed voice pretty much all the time. Uh, this is what's so confusing about mixed voice, and we'll jump right into it. Um, Mixed voice or registers in general is a little bit of a metaphor used by teachers to explain a very complicated thing with lots of variables involved and lots of different options. So I think this is again why it's so confusing. I think the terminology of mixed voice can lead to a certain confusion that can lead to a kind of tension, which is thinking that you are literally squishing your chest and your head voice together at the same time to create like a mixed sound. That's maybe not quite the right way of thinking about what we're talking about here. Yeah, exactly. This is so exciting. And please, yeah, keep asking questions. So, what is a register? I highly recommend as a resource. It's always great to kind of have some other things to look at. Check out the website voicescienceworks.org. Um, Sing backwards. If we're going to talk about this, there's so much about the perception of what mixed voice is and what registers are in general. Again, check out this website, voicescienceworks.org. You'll notice that a lot of famous singing teachers, John Henney, some of these other books, they'll always cite this in the back. And this is actually somebody that I know here in LA, and he and his wife created this website with some actual scientific articles, lots of research talking about some of these complicated issues and why they're so complicated. There is something in the vocal toolbox on that website, which is a category on the left side, and it's what are registers? Question mark. And the first thing that you'll read, which I also agree with, is that registers are largely a metaphor to explain something that is more complicated with lots of variables. Um, we generally talk about registers almost as a way to define the dysfunction between these two different parts of our voice. And we have this break in between the two, right, where we crack. And we talk about chest voice and head voice. And that's largely the terms are based on the perception of how and where we feel the resonance in these voices. Um, so we talk about feeling resonance in our chest in the chest voice and feeling resonance. Perhaps you can kind of feel it in the back of your head, although more of a sensation and perception of the sound and the vibration coming from the back of the head. But it's really important to note that all of this is primarily happening here in the vocal tract. That's where we have our resonator. So this is all sympathetic vibration based on what we're doing here. And there's a lot of complexity. But I don't want to say that throw out the term chest voice and head voice. They're very helpful as you start to learn all of this stuff. It's just very much human nature to want to have these binaries and try to create an and an or, you know what I mean? Like chest voice and head voice as a separate thing. a lot of the old school way of training the voice is thinking about unifying these two registers into one smooth function. Now, really, uh, again, we define registers by the fact that if you're not singing well, or you're purposefully doing this, sometimes we do this as a style, you're going to have a break between your lower register and your higher register, which have a slightly different function needed, almost like a gear shift in a car. Right? We have a lower RPM and a higher RPM, and we kind of have to figure out ways to shift and have a handoff from one to the other. Um, so the thing that's hard about this is, so like the traditional realm, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about sort of where the voice pedagogy is and why it's this way. Um, Traditionally, or at least where we are with the science, people think about it a lot about what's happening with the vocal folds. And we talk about chest voice resonance, our lower speaking range, is having more surface area with our chords coming together more, and head voice being less surface area, where it's kind of just off a tiny bit of the tissue. And there's muscles that kind of help us move back and forth. Now, we kind of traditionally have talked about this as like a handoff, like in terms of like one muscle group is dominant to the other. And this is very human nature to think about this sort of transition. I'm not going to go deep into it, but check out this voicescienceworks.org website when we're talking about the physiology and everything. Um, it's one thing that we've noticed in science that there's more surface area with the chords as we're lower, and then they get a little bit uh, kind of like there's just less tissue as we go up to our higher range. Um, but there's all these other variables that are important to talk about. We've got breath pressure. We talked about just now the tissue surface area. We've got acoustics and resonance, and of course our perception. So that's why I'm kind of juggling all of these balls to talk about this concept. Again, chest voice, head voice, mixed voice, they're all kind of metaphorical ways to explain the sensation and these transitions that we want in order to have a smooth transition from one resonant place to the next. I really like to think about it as resonance. I'm really big on that, and jumping tiers of resonance and having a handoff of resonance. And we do this a lot through vowel modification and using the path of least resistance, the ways that we can best access either register, and then figuring out how to make a slow and subtle modification to transition from one to the other. Um, but again, I think I want to break everyone's idea of thinking about this as two separate things and that you're smushing them together. Um, I think one way of talking about it too is we have these break ranges, right? Sometimes historically people talk about a break range a little lower than we think, and then a break range where absolutely we have to switch from a chest voice sound to a head voice sound. Uh, Really, the way of thinking about it is we have these two options. We have our chest voice and our head voice. Yeah, one whole voice exactly. And there's a point where they kind of are interlocked, right? Where our higher chest voice, we can continue a certain kind of resonance past where we could switch, and we're in this sort of zone where there's lots of options where we can kind of go back and forth between different sort of strategies. And then eventually at the what we call like the true passaggio, where people are like there's one main passaggio where we crack. That's where you absolutely have to switch to a different style, to a different placement of resonance, or else your body's going to do it for you. And that's what a crack is. You kind of pop up into one or the other, or get stuck somewhere in between and kind of stall out. I like that car analogy. I think that can be very helpful. So as a prerequisite, I have to say, if you are not used to singing, if you don't have a clear understanding of what it feels like to sing in your low chest voice and haven't worked on that, I recommend checking out all the stuff on support. Um, yes, we're going to be demonstrating a ton of things. Totally, totally. But yeah, I recommend take a look at that first, because this takes some skill and understanding in the sensations. Look at support and strengthening your voice, your lower register for chest voice, and then check out all the stuff on head voice. And we're going to talk about this. Yes, the tongue is a big part of this. I always talk about the tongue as the gatekeeper between our registers. And when our tongue is really tight, we have a clear division between them, and we can purposefully crack or flip up and down between them. but our ability to soften and relax our tongue and modify our vowel shapes is going to help us jump different tiers of resonance. And again, there's so many different variables involved, and people do different strategies for mixing. Um, the first thing, just like as I mentioned, is to make sure that you actually have a good understanding of support connection in your chest voice, doing all of these kinds of exercises like, ma, 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 more speech like, right? We do these things like, hey there. If you're trying to get into your chest voice, think more speech voice function. And you do feel a little bit of sympathetic vibration here when everything's functioning correctly. So that's why sometimes I say it's okay to put your hand here to feel for that vibration. Just know that we're not creating the sound really from there or the vibration. It's all from up here. Um, One thing is when people are working on mixed voice is they're just not supporting enough and bringing their chest voice high enough to start kind of working on that realistically. So that's something that I find a lot with students who are trying to figure that out. And I recommend first really get some solid practice with your chest voice in your low to middle range. You don't have to go into your highest notes. Um, the other thing is make sure that you have understanding of your head voice function and can access that, which is this feeling of coming from above. It's a much lighter, kind of hollow sound. Sometimes I talk about how, in like the previous live streams, talked about how it's, a lot of people do head voice function without realizing it, like talking to an animal or some sort of cartoonish character voice. And you're like, hey, oh, hey, how's it going? And then you realize actually that you do it more often than you think. So chest voice in general, this function, yes. Oh, yeah. We're gonna answer all of these questions. There's so much to set this up. Um, so chest voice in general, we're talking about more surface area on the vocal folds. It's gonna be a little more of a kind of a brassy, uh, pressed sound, and then head voice naturally has this sort of lighter, kind of floaty quality. Now, when we're talking about mixing, we want to try to find a little bit of the opposite in each style so that we can stitch them together. And this is, again, the practice of trying to unify your registers. It's all a little bit of a metaphor, but it can be really helpful to kind of guide yourself to this one voice concept. So again, you need to work on strengthening your chest voice. You need to work on, once you strengthen your chest voice, finding a little bit of a breathier tone tends to really help people. We'll talk about this. And then also in head voice, we tend to have this issue where it's too breathy and it feels like this really extreme transition from like a very strident sound to a very breathy sound. We want to focus on our head voice sounding a little more full. And in some of these other live streams, I've talked about chord compression, this concept of bringing the chords together a little more in head voice. And this is going to help you have a smoother transition so that you have a lightness in your chest voice. And then as you switch into head voice, you have a slightly more full head voice sound. And that makes for a really, really clean transition. One way of thinking about it is keeping all the dishes on the table, you pull the tablecloth off, and you keep them all there. And we're making these really fast, seamless transitions. What's hard is that there's lots of places to switch and lots of options because our chest voice goes a little past where our head voice is in every register, every voice type. Uh, and our head voice starts a little lower and our chest voice can go a little go a little higher, and there's this space where we have more ability to transition from one to the other. On the extreme sides, if you try to sing head voice and chest voice, I talked about this in my pitch class and intonation, you're not going to be able to drop low enough. It's just a physiological thing. uh, Same thing if you're trying to go up into your highest register, you're going to hurt yourself. And that was in our vocal health thing. If you're trying to really go all the way fully in chest voice, uh, you're ultimately going to have too much pressure and too much surface area on your chords. And so we need eventually we have to switch into head voice, and your body will do it for you. That's kind of the point of cracking, is it kind of just bails up into the place that feels more comfortable if you're trying to hold it too hard and in one particular zone of resonance. Um, so again, it's sort of defined a lot by the dysfunction of the fact that we can't do a proper gear shift from one style of resonance to the other. Now, okay, let's. Oh, there's so much here. I wanna read all of what you guys are talking about. So some of it again is in the conditioning and fitness. Now, let's talk about some options here. So the reason why I do in my practice a lot of like the wa and ya is there particular vowels that help us move from one register to the other. These more open vowels like and and these kinds of things are easier in chest voice. We get a little more sound moving towards the mask or the front of our face. So mana. These are all very belty kinds of things to get that buzz here. Whereas the back of our head, or in the back of our vocal tract, we're able to get many of these higher partial sounds, the resonance, and those are from more closed vowels like oo or e, which can be kind of awkward and feel tricky in our chest voice, but are much more comfortable in head voice. So the best way to figure out mixing between your ranges is to use the vowel that's most comfortable in each range first and do a subtle transition. Um, yeah, we're gonna work on this. And again, have patience with this. A lot of mixed voice practice is a lighter practice. So you want to do your conditioning and your stretching on the side, work chest voice, work head voice, and then come to this practice where we work on our mixed voice. Um, so one thing that we can practice for getting a lighter sound in our chest voice is thinking about that breathy tone. And this is one of the variables. If we are really, really pressing with our support down here, really engaging into that and pushing to the front of our mask, we're going to be more likely in a chest voice place, and it's going to keep us there. And so the typical sound of someone lifting their chest voice too high, or the typical look, is the head and the neck coming out like this, and you're blocking off resonance from the back of your vocal tract. Um, so one of the reasons why I start with this resonance stuff and I do like the humming and the circle of vowels is to get a sense of where those higher vibrations are so I can kind of know where that ladder is. And this is all sensation based, where I can kind of jump to higher and higher tiers of resonance. So one example is using a glide like ya or wa. We start with the E, which keeps everything a little further back in our vocal tract. Now you have to be careful if you're going E and spreading or these kinds of things, or ooh with your jaw coming out. That's going to pull you more into this area. That's more of a belty kind of technique when we spread from the front of our face. So when I'm working on something, even in chest voice, and I'm like, yeah, I'm working on trying to make sure that yeah. I shift the tongue coming up and down, and I'm not yeah. That's gonna serve to pull you down into a chest voice sound more. Um, so I highly recommend doing these kinds of things. We're already preparing in chest voice for a transition. So I like to start this kind of stuff early in the practice. So we're going like ya, and you're just trying to make sure that this stuff on the outside doesn't try to engage or get tight. Another one that I do all the time that's also helpful for this concept is doing the like wa we, and the goal is to try and drop into this vertical shape. We're going ah to kind of get the sense of that open scaffolding, and then a e wa we. It's not twang, not quite yet. Actually, twang is when you're coming a little more forward and like nya nya, and that's resonance that's going to come more from the mask. So we're purposefully trying to avoid too much twang and actually get more from the back of the vocal tract, and that's going to help you transition into head voice better. So again, we're going like ya, creating that space. Wah. I'm trying to keep that nice resonance in the back. So a lot of classical techniques are already trying to make this even transition between the registers. That's sort of the old, like, romanticized bel canto technique, is to have this. Um, yeah, exactly. So yeah, twang is a little more of a forward placement thing where we're like our tongue is purposely coming forward and we're creating a brighter sound that way. We do create brightness from yeah, 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 but it's more from the back part of the vocal tract is what we're trying to go for. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes we're talking about having more release in the front of our mouth so that, like imagining there's a tennis ball or these kinds of things. Although I would say be careful because sometimes when people think that way, they hold the face and that causes a different kind of tension. So that's why I like to do these kind of more fluid glide motions to kind of feel the difference between high to low. Now, what we're doing, are you talking about me? My name's Abram, by the way. Hi and welcome. um, so what I would talk about here is tongue mobility, getting our tongue to move. Now, if our tongue gets really rigid and locked in place, that's going to keep us in one register or the other. So by going like, yeah, 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 we're able to kind of flick through this sort of shape in different resonant sort of places. And I'll show you what I mean when we actually start switching up into head voice, but you want fluidity here and flexibility. A lot of the times when I work with students, right away you can tell that their tongue is hi, welcome. Yeah, their tongue is stuck and it can't move very well, or it's locking down or pressing up. Right, if it gets stuck pressing up, that's more twang. If it's pressing down and locking, that's more of that kind of like throaty sound. Sometimes you get that with certain artists, even in contemporary world, but sometimes it's like the fake opera sound, right? They're like, "Ah, and that's the tongue really pulling back and locking. That's going to block you. You're going to crack a lot if you do that too much. Same thing again with the twang. So we're just trying to get flexibility here and motion. It's not that one thing is wrong compared to the other. Um, so that's one thing. And then the other thing, and I talk about this in the head voice practice or a lot of the different classes with head voice, our tongue tends to be the barrier between our registers when it roots down or gets tight. And so one thing is to practice going from a bright to a darker vowel, like A to O, E to U. And we're talking about a more spread vowel, a more neutral vowel is what the way I like to think about it for a better transition to a more covered vowel, and that's actually going to get you more resonance from the back when you do that more covered vowel. Again, the idea is like spreading. We actually collapse the back a little bit. It's like a megaphone. If we're like, yeah, like that kind of thing, collapsing. But oh, we're gonna get it to come in kind of more from the back, and we're keeping that tract open. So that's why these more closed vowels can be helpful for that. I practice trying to keep my tongue very still as I'm switching from bright to dark. So that's doing like what I did in the head voice class where we're like just trying to use my lips to change those overtones, and that's going to help you just have a little more control over your tongue. Can I move it? Can I keep it still? It's just a really strong muscle in the body. It's one of the strongest muscles in the body, and so it always wants to help and do extra. And sometimes it gets stuck, and then our body has to bail or crack up. You can actually, one thing I would talk about is you can learn to own your cracks and control them specifically by adding pressure and releasing them. Be like, oh, I went in from head voice down into chest voice and purposefully made it happen. So if you're having a lot of cracking when you're practicing mixing, actually try to do cracking in a more gentle way and see if you can learn it as a skill and as a style rather than something to avoid. There's always this sort of danger of like, oh, avoid that thing. And then you keep thinking about it and then it like keeps happening. It's like, oh no, I'm going to crack. I'm going to crack. Learn it as a style first, and then you learn how to turn it off. So let's start to talk about mixing. So again, first you want to work on getting that light kind of chest voicey sound. You can do breathy exercises like doing like fogging the mirror is one thing that I'll do where you're thinking about adding a little more air, like we're trying to find that softer tone, but at the same time, keep this space open. It's not the same thing as whispering. When we whisper, we tend to squeeze, and that's actually sort of the wrong idea. So we call it breathiness more, which is your ability to have a little bit of yeah, that extra sort of padding of breath, and that's going to keep everything more relaxed. Yeah, it's sort of like the sigh thing. So I have exercises where I do like sometimes on a minor pattern, and I'll go like yeah, yeah. And mainly it's just helping you not have these impulses of squeezing or flinching. If you have lots of those habits with support, it's going to be really hard to mix. That's again why we work on strengthening our chest voice and having control over our lower support so that it doesn't come from here or from back here. So the more you can kind of get that out of your coordination habits, the better and the easier it's going to be to start mixing. Sometimes we talk about just sing in a lighter place and you're more likely to find it. Now, if you're singing really light, like you're whispering and you're squeezing and collapsing, that's not what we're talking about. You need more engagement in your support. Otherwise, you're just squeezing this space and you're going to get a lot of tension from that. Um, the other side, really quickly, is in head voice, right? We are more closed vowels are easier to access. They look taller, that it almost looks like an ah with a high tongue. But if we're like, that's a super loose floppy tongue. This is a little bit of review from the other sections because again, you really have to understand chest voice and head voice as separate sensations before you can start to put them together. Now, going to like A and O or ah, it's harder to maintain that solid sound, right? Like it has to be back here, and we have to make sure we don't. That's going to be too much chest voice function. Um, and then eventually, if this is already really hard, go back to head voice stuff and really start to figure that out a little bit. Um, Now, I mentioned this a little bit in the other classes. There's when we're transitioning from chest voice to head voice, one of the best ways to think about it is going from an ah to an e. It's a glorified large yaw, but kind of in reverse as you go up, and then back down as a yaw as you come down. Um, the trick is you can't let it do this. That's gonna be pulling into chest voice, collapsing the back. We need instead yeah. Now, do you notice? I kind of stepped off the gas a little bit as I go around this area. You have to be really cautious of not engaging your tongue and your jaw as you come up, as the vibrations kind of pass through this area. This is what we call the break range or passaggio, where it gets really difficult to transition. You have to be more careful. So it's like almost like driving around a curve, right? You accelerate into the curve, you step off the gas, and then you accelerate back out of the curve. This is the case with head voice. It feels like a C shape. We're going from a more forward, yeah, exactly. So the concept is we're using vowels that are helpful at first for narrowing, right? An E vowel, if you're doing it correctly with natural resonance in the back, is a taller shape. Like that. Whereas ah is going to be a little wider. Um, it's funny in head voice, an E looks kind of like an ah shape, right? So we don't want to be ah. It's ah. Can you see that it's really just the tongue ah coming up and down? The tongue helps us bounce to higher and higher overtones. So that's the path of least resistance. Um, I would recommend practicing this. You're probably going to have a break range for a while, and you just try to soften that area. So I'll be like, ah, if you're like, yeah, that's a sign that there's a lot of things trying to engage and help up here. Go back to some chest voice support work. Go back to head voice stuff and try to see if you can get it nice and smooth and relaxed. I like to put my hand here, like, right, sort of coming back down and up. If you're holding a lot of tension, it's hard to relax down back into chest voice. These are all just sort of anecdotal tips to help with this. Now, what's hard is doing something where it's one consistent vowel all the way up and down. So, for example, like I do that wah, way, we in chest voice to get a feeling of that sort of stacked higher placement in my chest voice before I go up to head voice. If I were to go like, it's much harder as you do a single vowel. So the idea is we go through A to E to get a sensation of climbing that ladder of resonance up and down, and then try other vowels. So like hey. It's getting harder and harder. Trust me. I'm like working hard to make sure that it doesn't crack too much. And if you're listening closely, you might hear like a little bit of a transition. We just try to hide that a little bit and soften as we transition. So eventually, the hardest thing is to do like ah. And the reason I can make that smooth transition is because I have an understanding of creating a more full head voice sound and a lighter chest voice sound. And you can start to connect them together a little bit. So that's just sort of the first preliminary idea. Like you can practice sort of jumping back and forth. That's a great way to work on switching, like doing like, you could do na chest voice, na nu na na. You can separate them out, and then na practicing that ability to kind of come up and down that sliding scale. So that's one sort of idea. Again, thinking of that breathiness sometimes helps people if they're getting a little stuck in chest voice and you're breaking a lot. So think of like like a little more of that sort of white noise breathiness. Um, Again, sort of these concepts of how we mix. It's not just about surface area. If you look at the research, there's all these variables about breath pressure and how we work that, and acoustics and our understanding of resonance and our ability to sort of perceive and climb that ladder of resonance. So what I start to do is that's kind of going from chest voice to head voice, really in a wide range thing. What's harder is when we start actually trying to mix in more specific, smaller spaces. That's when people run into this issue where they're trying to like smush their chest voice to their head voice instead of seeing it as like a sliding scale, that there's this handoff of resonance and we have multiple options. Um, Doing water bubbles yeah, yeah, exactly, work on that support stuff, right? Because the idea of support, again, isn't necessarily about loudness, it's about pressure so that these muscles don't try to compensate, don't try to squeeze, and you're able to keep more openness. And that's how I'm able to make a better transition. So it's also through conditioning a little bit. You might be like, well, why is, it's so easy for me, but not for you, a lot of it has to do with the regular practice. So that's why I'm always putting a plug for that. Like work on chest voice, low to medium range, work on head voice, low to medium range, and then try to put them together. So I do some of these exercises like na to ne, and I do it in this middle range. And the reason is because so in head voice, smaller vowels are a little easier. So E, A is kind of in the middle. On chest voice, na, I can kind of put it in somewhere in a slightly breathier, kind of more middle ground. And this way I'm transitioning to something that's a little more in between the two places. We'll talk about belt versus a light head voice function technique in a second, because there's different ways to mix. And again, this is what causes a lot of confusion is like, what style are you going for? What are you trying to attempt? Are you trying to get softer in a situation? Or are you trying to get louder without cracking? Those are different sort of strategies, because there's lots of options for mixing. I wish I could demonstrate with some songs. I highly recommend you take some classes with me, or something one-on-one where we can actually work on specific styles and you can really see how this starts to work. So yeah, again, this is where my range is. With every range, there's going to be a slightly different place where you have your passaggio. I just finished writing some blogs on different range voice types that will show up on the website soon, which helps people understand sort of where that's going to be. But you can kind of feel it out, right? Like best way is to feel where your voice cracks in a light way, and then sort of figure out what note that is on a piano, or where it is on the staff. And that's going to give you actually a good sense of where your range is too, in a lot of ways, is how we mix and where. So again, head voice starts a little lower than where chest voice finishes, and chest voice finishes a little higher than where head voice starts. And then head voice can take over on the other side. So there's a mixed voice range in the middle where we have lots of options. So this is where I start to play with this thing. So let's say we're here. This is for me as a kind of a tenor in this sort of area. I might start with a high chest voice, like no, no, going for that sort of brassier sound. No, 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 and then switch to a head voice sound. No, no, no. And I'm trying to get a lighter, breathier chest voice and a more full sounding head voice. So I'm like, no, no, no. You see, I'm pulling back a little bit. No, no, no. Maybe I want to go a little more belty on the top. No, no, no. I'm trying to make sure I don't go nah completely out this way, but no, no. Have a little bit of that space. That's maybe more towards a belty sound. We'll talk about kind of pushing further that way. And then thinking about a lighter version is going to be very light chest voice, like no, no, no. And I'm able to make a smoother transition. So you can play around with this. You can do like Narnia. That's going to be a little easier. You'll notice a lot of singers when they're switching between registers, actually just intuitively will actually go up to like a head voice E, especially for lower voice singers. We'll go up to a head voice E and then back down to an because it's sort of the path of least resistance. So again, you can see that this is just a smaller version of what I did with that larger sliding scale, the siren. I'm going like but we tend to lock in place when we think of more specific, smaller notes, like na na some of it is about this sort of shape of the vowels and how I'm not spreading. I'm keeping it more stacked on the vocal tract, so it's easier to line up. Some of it has to do with the breath pressure and having not too forceful of breath pressure in chest voice, and maybe a little more engagement in head voice. So you can see there's lots of variables involved, and this is why mixed voice singing is kind of, in some ways, the most advanced, because you're using all the skills and the options to find just the right tone quality for whatever you're doing. Not too loud, not too soft. It depends on the moment. So let's talk about sort of the two different realms, right? We talk about like a chest voice dominant mix, which is a belt, which is the most common, and a head voice sort of dominant mix, which is more of our breathy, kind of light, sometimes we call it like falsetto singing. And using these, one or the other can be key to a song, right? So with belting, we want to actually still have some of that megaphone sound, but we're keeping some of the height. I like to use the yaw, and you want to think of that sort of breathy coming down instead of like no, right, where it's a little more shouty. We're thinking like yaw, yaw. That's really what it's all about. It's just sort of, can you keep this backspace open, or are you completely stuck this way? Yeah, you can get all that sort of space, and you can lean into it a little more, like no. But I'm really trying to focus and make sure that some of that resonance comes from the back. I'm like no, yeah, and you can kind of keep going up as you go higher and higher. It's going to need to be a little taller, like a chest voice sound. So we actually make it a little more tall like this versus nah, that's going to be more shouty, right? That's going to pull us into a full chest voice and it gets too kind of whiny. So singers are constantly sort of modifying the shape and how much breathiness, how much pressure we're putting into our sound to get just the right kind of resonant place. The lighter technique is the opposite sort of strategy, right? We're thinking about more head voice and we're like, maybe it's like, we're really bright, really, really, really light at the bottom, like la, right? We're not trying to sit too hard into our chest voice, but we're thinking of this very, very soft, kind of breathier tone. There's so many examples of this where people are just trying to hold their chest voice up, and they're like, na na versus na na ya ah. And so we're just negotiating that. As you have wider vowels, you need more support to maintain that open space so you can keep it nice and soft. Um, yeah. So this is sort of the main concept. It takes a lot of sort of practice and working with someone, understanding your registers, understanding what those feelings are to start to kind of properly transition from one side to the other. Now it's funny again in the science, like typically, anecdotally, people were talking about like uh, the tissue being like thicker in chest voice and then kind of pulling back and to a thinner sort of amount of surface area for head voice. And it actually follows a little bit of the shape that we do. This like when we do that, it naturally kind of helps those muscles engage. And they talked about it as like one muscle group being dominant from the other. I won't go super deep into this again, but it's actually more nuanced than that. In fact, they're always constantly engaged and re-engaging. And so again, you want to go more with this concept of vowel modification, sensing resonance, and controlling all these different variables to get the correct tone quality that you want. Um, yeah. There's check out our website. That's one part of this. Um, yeah, nay, nay. If we think about it too, so consonants kind of bring us in different directions. So like ma is a forward placed consonant, it's a little more in the mask. Na in the middle, and then nga is in the back. So you can actually start to kind of feel where that resonance is and where you're sort of particularly angling. So changing your consonants might help. That's why na is somewhere in between the two. That's why we're doing it as a mixed strategy. Doing a ma is going to pull you more into a chest voicey kind of belty place. Now, we don't always get the benefit of being able to sing the most comfortable vowels in certain situations. So the idea here with the practice is to use these sort of paths of least resistance to get the feeling and then try to transfer it over to um, and try to transfer it over to other vowel shapes, which get harder and harder to do. So again, you could do like, Narnia, and then you could go Narnia, and then maybe na na. And that's going to be some of the hardest stuff is to switch that way. So you can see you can tell a lot about the voice just by quickly going like, but easier said than done. Um, yeah, it's all vowel modification. It's all about when we change the shape of our tongue and our lips, we're accessing slightly different resonant places, formants, and one of the lessons on smooth tone, I showed this app called Spectrum View, and it analyzes your overtones, and you can actually see how we're emphasizing certain overtones and muting other ones, and that's how we transition. So it has a lot to do with the shape of the vocal tract, how our tongue is moving. And the easiest way, again, to feel it is to pass from an ah vowel in chest voice up to a more narrow vowel in head voice. And that's going to actually help you bump up to higher tiers of resonance as long as you're engaging support appropriately so that you're not squeezing or creating any bad habits here. So um, it's all about overtone singing and resonance in a lot of ways. So I think that's kind of the biggest and most important thing. That's why we start with the circle of vowels. I'm talking about trying to kind of feel out how each vowel has a particular kind of resonance or ring to it. And then you can learn to sort of surf that wave as long as you don't lock in place with your jaw and your tongue. That's why it's so important to try and keep these areas really relaxed and just use this area of our vocal tract. Um, is that making sense to everyone? I always like to stop a little bit before and answer some questions. Again, it's about tongue tension a lot of the time. We want flexibility in our tongue. That's why I do like ya 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 wah 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 ya ya ya, and then trying to get my tongue to stay still, like Way-oh, ay-oh, 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 ay-oh. That way I have better control over those muscles and I can modify them to bump from one sort of vowel place to the other. So if you're singing like a really belty song, it's going to be a little more megaphony. But I would say belting is still a mix. So if you're squeezed shut like this, you're going to hurt yourself. That's a problem. You're going to squeeze and you're going to inhibit the vocal folds from being able to flap together in the right way. Now, if you're doing it a little bit like that, you can actually keep some of that space, get a forward resonance and a belty sound, or you could do like that, and you're gonna get a little more of a light tone, kind of head voicey sound. Um, yes, I do. I also teach privately. So look it up, look me up. Uh, anyways, yeah, that's sort of the idea. And of course, I do have to preface, like my voice, I'm a higher tenor, so my voice tends towards having a really smooth transition. So in some ways, if you're like a lower singer, just stick with it. It takes some time to get comfortable with that kind of transition. For some voice types, it comes a little more naturally than others. Every voice type is a little different with how we approach mixing do we want to be more chest voice dominant or more head voice dominant. So like as a tenor, I can be very, very light sometimes up in that sort of register, sound kind of like an alto, and sometimes sound more belty and full. And that sometimes, again, it has a little bit to do with where your voice sits too, but everyone can learn for the most part some basic mixing and understand how to transition in a really smooth way. Again, it's just if you might be like a really low alto, you might do less in your head voice than some other singers. Uh, it just depends again on what your style is and what kind of songs you're trying to do. My last name is Polyakov. Here, I'll type in so you can all find me. There it is. Yeah. So again, the concept here is when we have certain kinds of tension habits, when we're trying to support our sound by squeezing these muscles, it's going to make it very hard to mix. If you're like ma ma doing that kind of stuff, you're blocking the vocal tract from having that resonance. Ma ma ma. The whole goal is to have that space kind of stay open. That's going to help you a lot. So that's why I talk about like strengthening the voice and conditioning with support is so important. Getting a full sound in your head voice is really important. And then you just practice sort of like switching back and forth in different songs in different places. And I encourage you like listen to singers who do a lot of mixing and try to see if you can tell where they're switching a little bit between one or the other. Sometimes it helps as we're figuring this out to have more conscientious choices of like, now I'm going to sing more in chest voice. Now I'm going to sing in more head voice. But again, I lead with it's all really one voice. And the more you can find that smooth transition, the more you break this concept a little bit and you find all these really interesting in between places. We're always calibrating a little bit depending on what we're doing. So maybe another way to sort of explain this is high chest voice tends to get a little strident. So we have to work on being able to relax that. Low head voice is hard to support fully. So it gets kind of wispy and breathy sounding. And we have to use resonance and the right kind of placement to amplify that sound. Yeah, I teach guitar and piano and all the instruments. I think as a singer, it's good to be able to kind of play and sing at the same time. It helps you. Karaoke tracks could be really a little less organic, right? When you need some time to feel how your voice is coordinating. So yeah, again, the trick is head voice really low is hard to make a full sound. Chest voice really high eventually kind of has a breaking point where you're creating too much pressure and surface area on the voice, and you're not able to access those partials. Yeah, I'm on the things. So that's why I'm talking about how you have to make sure your chest voice is high enough so that when you switch into head voice is in a high enough place that you can support it in a more full way. So the best mixing place is somewhere in between the two registers, right? So if your head voice is just starting here, unless you're doing very, very gentle singing, you're not going to want to transition right there. If you're singing falsetto gentle stuff, you're going to start with that first sort of transition place a little bit where you can start to sing into head voice. But if you're singing a more full tone, you're going to want to be somewhere kind of in the middle. And then eventually you're going to have to switch more into head voice as you come to the other side, right? If you're trying to carry your chest voice up all the way, that's you're going to reach a breaking point. And I promise you, like everyone who's singing high belting in a healthy endurance based way is using some of that backspace and some breathiness to kind of ease the pressure so that we're not completely squishing our vocal cords together. And that, that's the idea is the surface area, too much surface area and too much pressure. And you're going to start to fatigue and kind of bruise your vocal folds, right? And we talked about that last week. So it's really all about this illusion, actually. Loudness is more about resonance and switching between these different sort of registration styles. Actually, in fact, we have a little time. I'll show you something interesting. This is just this Spectrum View sort of tonal overtone analyzer. And I'll just show you what sort of chest voice looks like compared to head voice, and you can start to see just sort of how the strategy is different. So let's say I'll do ma ma ma. Or maybe I'll do the circle of vowels. That it looks a little cooler. So you're gonna see a lot of densely stacked overtones, kind of in this area. Now, when I sing head voice like this, um, whatever it is, you're going to see that they start to get wider spaced. That's sort of the idea here is like almost like imagining like chest voice. We have these kind of closer overtones all in this more strident place. That's that full sound. And then head voice, do we have actually more space? It's almost like imagining like sprinting versus like a long distance running. We're putting a lot of energy in the bottom for head voice. And we're popping up these higher tiers of resonance. Now, if your head and your neck is collapsed like this, you can't access those no matter what. And you're going to start to push and strain. So that's why it's so important to have this alignment and to really make sure that your head doesn't come out off its axis too much. That's why all the singing teachers are like, make sure you have the proper posture and alignment. It's really has a lot to do with here. Like imagine if you're like a saxophone player and you go to play your instrument and you immediately start blowing into it and you're like, you know what I mean? That's sort of what happens with the voice sometimes. Yeah. So that's the idea is can we just keep this stable and open? And that's going to help you transition. And then think about these more narrow vowels for helping you go up into head voice. If you're really wide and megaphony, it's going to be very hard to switch up into head voice and you might crack or have some sort of unnatural kind of strain that comes from it. Stay light, use some of this breathy thing. If you're going for that light sort of falsetto thing, again, it's like, here's a concept. So if you're going for these kinds of concepts, you can kind of think of it a little bit like in speech. We can naturally control our volume and breath pressure and all of these things by thinking about like a really, really gentle, like, hey, how's it going? And I'm not talking about don't whisper, don't squeeze, but think more like you're like, hi, how is it? Hey, very, very light. And then, compare it to like, hey, you guys, is like a shouty sort of concept. We can go in between these two opposites. We can be like, hey, 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 hey. And you can actually start to find somewhere in between these. So you can be like, yeah. Maybe I want to be really, yeah. Do you see? I used a little more of a head voicey kind of. And I'm singing up on a G, right? Some people when they're singing up in G's, they can't help but kind of go that way, right? I'm finding sort of that in between place. That's really the key to a lot of this mixing stuff is thinking about that sort of a lighter, whispery sound, but still engaging your support. So that's sort of the problem is when we think of like a light tone, we tend to let go of our belly and our back too much. And then we, yeah, kind of squeeze in the back. And then we want to avoid that. It's, yeah, keeping all of that space. And then from there, once you learn the middle, then you can actually start to press into it a little bit. Like I was thinking of like like an extreme sport. If you're belting, you're sort of riding the edge a little harder. It's going to be a little more fatiguing, and you want to be really careful not to let it completely collapse because then your voice kind of goes splat. So that's kind of the danger of it. It's just the nature of singing. A lot of our favorite songs are pop music naturally in a sort of a more belty range. So I recommend, if you're doing a lot of belting and your tongue is getting really tight because that happens from belting, you're getting a lot of jaw tension. Try an opposite style. Try something like a light folk song and try to find your light, flexible agility. Work a tune like that, and then come back to your belty song and try to implement some of that feeling. Again, a lot of this is muscle memory. So that's why we're going through the paths of least resistance, trying to feel, um, what it's like when there's ease, and then trying to repeat that with harder and harder vowel shapes. So sometimes it's just hard to know what's hard and what's easy with the voice. And sometimes, singing a certain note with a certain timbre, certain amount of energy and dynamics makes it particularly hard. For how long you're sitting on it, all of these sort of variables come into play. And so when we're working on a really truly good mix, sometimes it's really just dependent on like specific the person, their voice type, the thing that they're accomplishing. And so we angle our exercises to sort of work with that the best. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the concept. Yes, yes, it is best to say tall in the back of the throat for head voice. That's where we get that high resonance is from the very, very top, kind of more slender part of the vocal tract. And so, absolutely. So chest voice tends to be a little more forward, masky, and head voice tends to come more from the back. And that's sort of the perception of the chest voice and the head voice function. And again, a lot of our concepts of mixing comes from our perception of what it's like as the resonance kind of we feel it kind of moving through our body a little bit, right? Through our chest and up and through our head. But it's really all just happening right here. And that's why it can be kind of misleading. We feel like we're singing from here. We're singing from here, from the top of our head, like up there. But it's really actually, again, all about the mutes and stops of our tongue and our lip shape. So wah, ya, these are sort of the main things. And like wah kind of angles how bright or dark it is and helps us change where the overtones are resonating. And same thing with ya. And these two things together, and we can actually sort of find the sweet spot in any sort of situation, both light and loud singing. Yeah, so 100%, like I'm always thinking of this C shape for the smoothest path with the voice. Will feel like and again, that middle area, right, where the break is the hardest place to sort of transition. And I like to work through here and be like, na ne ya, na ne ya. Find the right amount of energy, right? I started a little more head voicey, then I added a little more chest voice, but I kept the same sort of space, one right after the next, like na ne ya, more chesty. Na ne ya, na ne ya. So I started to make my chest voice a little lighter, trying to match with the head voice. Depends on the song you're singing, right? Na ne ya, or na ne ya. They each have a slightly different feeling and vibe to them. And I encourage you to explore like sort of the range, like where are all the little in-between places. Ultimately, it's healthier to find something in the middle rather than going full belt or full like wispy head voice. A lot of the times we're trying to make a smooth transition, and that's why we start trying to artificially force it into place. Like my teacher would always say, and this is kind of an interesting, complex thought, but we sort of set up the space and try to we support so that the resonance comes from there, but we don't want to try and like place it so much as like trying to actually force our jaw or tongue into that position. That's going to cause a rigid placement, and that's going to make it really hard to transition. And you're going to crack probably, right? You can control that on purpose, but first and foremost, try to find that fluid. Yeah, 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 wah, 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 wah. See if you can control and change the overtones in a lower register, and then yeah, eventually you can do it with every vowel. Ah, and that's sort of the goal. Once you can do that with every vowel, then think about how many options you have. You can control your timbre in so many different ways, and then you become a masterful singer. And part of what I think being a masterful singer is, yes, you can have one very distinct style that you work on, but I find the really truly masterful singers are able to change their instrument and be like a little bit of a chameleon and adjust to whatever they need to accomplish in a song. And we can sort of fit ourselves into the sound in a way that potentially other instruments can't, because we have so many options and variables. And again, that's what makes mixed voice so complicated and so confusing. Is we're using all the things, right? We're using our breath pressure, we're thinking about vowel shape and space, um, as we move around in pitch, and volume dynamics, all of that, where the consonant is placed. So hopefully that's helpful and gives you something, kind of some food for thought to think about. And yes, I'm so glad that you've been seeing improvement, and we're making more and more content. So, please keep asking me questions. I always love to hear people's interpretation of what mixed voice sounds like. And again, if you want to read up more on this and kind of where I'm coming from and why the technique is the way that it is, I recommend check out voicescienceworks.org. It's just got some great information, and it's not like a lot, so you can read through an article, and it's not pages and pages and pages, but it's very thorough at the same time. So yeah, you guys are very welcome. And I never know what I'm doing next week. I've got to think about that. But it's funny, someone asked like, when are we going to work on mixed voice? I was like, oh, I think in a few weeks or something, and it was this week, so it's perfect timing. um let's see. Okay. So I recommend you take a look at the last live stream, which is about vocal health in general. When we're sick, our throat is a little potentially more irritated, the vocal folds. And so you're more likely to kind of hurt yourself, right? To have irritation and swollen folds when you're sick. It depends if it's a head cold. Sometimes it just sort of changes your perception of resonance. And in fact, don't quote me on this, but sometimes anecdotally, people have found that they actually have a better sensation of resonance when they have a little bit of a head cold, because they can really perceive where the vibrations are coming from in their face. That's really, really important as a singer, as a sensation, but it can be a little distracting in a certain way, because it sounds like you're in like a bathtub. But if you have something down lower and you're coughing a lot, the best thing is to not sing for a little bit, because you're going to be training in that habit and muscle memory of trying to push and strain on vocal folds that are a little puffy and swollen or bruised. Uh, and I'll put in one more little thing. It's kind of weird, but the vocal folds, when they come together, it's not really friction. We're not trying to like grate them together. So if they're like puffy and swollen, and you can't quite get the right sound, we tend to press harder into it, and that leads to vocal issues. Our voice, strangely enough, and this is why hydration is so important, we sing off of something called the mucosal wave, which is kind of a really cool concept I'll leave you guys with, which is that the vocal folds are kind of like thicker muscle tissue, and as they get closer and closer to where the surface where they contact, they become more like this gelatinous, eventually just mucus sort of fluid, and that's where the vibration initially kind of starts in a lot of ways, right? Is right at the oscillator. And so we're singing off of that mucus, essentially. It's kind of a little weird to think about, but that's why if you have too thick, it gets in the way, right? And we've got phlegm and stuff. Or if it's really dry, it's a problem, right? We're going to start to kind of irritate the tissue. So that's food for thought in terms of like if you're sick, what does that mean, right? Like we want adequate hydration so that our vocal folds can come together without really grating or irritating. It's just sort of like a vibration that at the very surface area. Yeah, exactly. There's all sorts of remedies like honey. I recommend go take a look at that the last live stream, and that can give you some thoughts. There's some other little things that I like to do, but it's just everybody's a little different with your anatomy and your nutrition and stuff like that. But fruits, oils, things that can help you sort of feel a little bit of hydration in your mouth and can be helpful as well in your throat, because the sensation of dryness even there can make us feel like our throat's really dry, even though it's the different. It's like the windpipe compared to the esophagus. So yeah, I recommend hydrate in advance. That's why it's so healthy and important for your voice to have proper hydration. And then you're actually able to mix better, right? When you have that elasticity in the voice. And that comes through training. The vocal folds, like there's little fibers that as you sing more and more and it conditions the voice, these little fibers stretch through the vocal folds and they actually make it more elastic, is what they've found with some of the science analysis. And that makes it a lot easier to do what I'm doing. And that's why I always have that plug of like, if you want to mix your voice or have mixed voice sound that's really smooth and comfortable, practice your chest voice, practice your head voice, and condition them so that eventually when you actually try to put them and transition them from one to the next in a really smooth way, you're gonna actually, it's gonna be a lot easier just naturally because your body's ready for it. Um, all right, all right. So I will catch you guys next week, and yeah, thanks for listening, and hopefully that's really helpful. And excited for the next project for us to all talk about. All right, take care, everyone.